spontaneously directs the adult's attention toward an object or an event. Or maybe just showing them something. Now, I'm going to draw a distinction here because you might have seen children on the autism spectrum direct an adult's attention. I've commonly seen it with a child who's looking toward something and they often do a reach, maybe an underhanded or an overhanded reach, even with some fussing. And they're directing the adult's attention, that's true. But they're directing the adult's attention probably because they want that object. So they're reaching toward a toy they can't get and fussing, and they get the adult to get it for them. But that's for an entirely different purpose. That's a regulatory function where you're getting the adult to do something for you. Joint attention is just about enjoying interacting with another human being. And typically developing infants start experiencing that, and they know that it's fun to interact with adults, and they're able to direct adults' attention toward interesting objects or events, just something that's in the room that they think is interesting. They may point toward the fan. They don't expect you to get the fan for them. They want you to see the fan. So that's initiating joint attention, and it's not something that we're going to see very often in infants and toddlers on the autism spectrum. So if infants are able to initiate joint attention, exactly how do they do that? Well, they've got lots of options. The first one is what's called the coordinated joint look. In that, the child looks at the adult, looks at an object, and looks back at the adult. Now, this looking is almost the same as if this child were old enough to say, "Hey, look at that really cool thing." So they're not talking, but they're able to use their eyes to direct your attention, and it's pretty clear that they just think something is really interesting and they want you to look at it. Another thing they might do is show. So they pick up an object and they hold it toward the adult, like, "Look at this." They don't want you to do anything. They're just showing it to you, like, "Look how cool this thing is." I've had kids bring me a dead roly-poly and like it was some kind of treasure, and it's just like, "You're cool and I need you to look at this thing." Sometimes they give, so they might actually hand the object to you, and it's pretty clear that they're not wanting you to do anything with it. It's just, "I'm going to share this with you." So sometimes they have something that they're just sure that you want, and they're not asking for your help. They're just giving it to you. And the last option is a point. This one comes in a little later. Sometimes kids seem to develop pointing at the end of that first year, but doing a point where you actually have what we would consider a pretty traditional, conventional point, getting that first finger out and separated, as a PT, you would know that that might not be one of the earliest skills, and so we don't expect to see an actual point. Maybe it's just kind of an open-handed reach at first, and then that develops into a point. But again, it's just to say, "Hey, look at that cool thing," not because they're asking you to get it for them. Responding to a joint attention is easier. So these are skills you're a little more likely to see in the child with autism spectrum disorder. Following a point, so the adult points to an object and the child is actually able to follow where that finger is pointing and look at that object. Following gaze is a little harder because I just turn and look at an object and you have to figure out that line from my eyes to the object I'm looking at. But both of these response to joint attention skills do occur in toddlers on the autism spectrum, but not always. So you may be working with a child who doesn't demonstrate either IJA or RJA. If they're a little more advanced, they at least can respond, but they're not as likely to initiate joint attention. So don't be confused if you see some behaviors that you think are IJA. Remember, they have to just serve the purpose of directing your attention, not really asking you to do something. So I'm a speech language pathologist. Here's why I care about joint attention, or at least part of it. For children on the spectrum, what we've learned is that their early joint attention skills tend to tell us a lot about what's going to happen with language. So for the child who just responds to joint attention bids from the adult, I'm not as positive about how things are going to turn out for them. For the child who is able to direct your attention, I think it's much more likely that we're going to see some positive gains in language if they get some good early intervention. And their language skills 1 to 10 years later are going to be better than that child who just responds to joint attention, and certainly better than the child who doesn't seem to share joint attention at all. So for me, joint attention is one of those early predictors and tells me a little bit about how likely this child is to be a successful communicator as they move into toddlerhood and preschool and on up to 10 years old. So what's it look like? We're expecting that a typically developing child can point to an object, then look at an adult's eyes, and often back to the object pretty easily by 11 to 14 months. So when you're looking at an infant who is going to later be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, you might see some gestures, and you might even see a point at that 11 to 14 months range. The difference is when a child with autism points, it is almost always to regulate other people's behavior, what we would consider proto-imperative. But it's not just to share focus, which is considered a proto-declarative. So think about that typical baby, and you, at 4 or 5 months, when you put him in a high chair, you stick one of those toys that has a little suction cup and it's supposed to stick on the high chair tray. Of course, it doesn't stick. So it starts out with the baby knocks it off, and they actually try to reach for the toy because they don't know that they can't reach it. That's at about 4 months. By about 6 months, though, what they've changed to is they knock the toy off, and then they do this very wimpy little reach, and they kind of go, and they look at an adult because they've figured out that you can get the big people to come get that toy for you. Is that joint attention the way that I'm talking about it? No, it wouldn't be, because they want the adult to do something. They want the adult to get the toy and put it back on the high chair tray. It's a great skill, and I'm happy that they're requesting in that way, but that's not the joint attention that I'm talking about. So go back to the baby sitting in the high chair, and all of a sudden they notice that the dog is running around the backyard. They're looking out the window and they see the dog, and they point and they look at the adult and they look back at the window. That's the kind of joint attention that I'm talking about, where I see something interesting happening and I want you to look at it. So it's not because I want you to go get me the dog. So be clear on the difference between using a point and a gaze to get something or to regulate other people's behavior, and using a point and a gaze just to share, just to interact. That's a very different level of interaction that we often don't see in kids on the autism spectrum. Here's what it might look like if a child's using an early gesture, contact pointing, to get your attention. Contact pointing is considered easier because the child's hand is actually touching something. So in this case, the child's touching the book. The child could be tapping on the lid of a jar of peanut butter, or they even might take your hand and put it on the jar of peanut butter. They just want you to notice that that's there. So the point here is that the adult's not going to do something for the child. They're just going to share attention, and the child's getting that attention with contact pointing. Later on, the child's able to do distal pointing, where their hand is out in space and they're not touching anything. Showing is another way that a child could initiate joint attention, just by showing you this cool object. And this is such a classic picture of my little nephew showing. So he's got a Christmas present that he got. He's very proud of it. He's got the big grin, those sparkly eyes. All of that is classic, hey, look what I've got, and isn't it cool? He doesn't want an adult to do anything for him or get anything for him. It's just showing, and it's sharing. Often I'll get a referral for a 3-year-old. Well, let's say in 1 week I get 3 3-year-olds, and none of them are talking, but only one of them has autism. Well, sometimes I feel like the most frequent referral for non-speaking preschoolers is, oh, we think they might have autism. So I'm glad that people are referring, and maybe they do have autism. But it's pretty easy for me to tell the difference in the first few minutes, because the child with autism doesn't comment. Okay, commenting, that's what we've been talking about. When I just show you something just because you're cool and I want you to see it. So maybe I have 3 kids. One has intellectual disability, one with autism, one who just has specific language impairment. The child with intellectual disability and the child who has specific language impairment will find